The last few months have been some of the most interesting and industry-defining moments in tech and in copyright history, with the case of Bart's versus Anthropic, which is set to really determine just how legal is it for these big AI companies to train their large language models on copyrighted material. Now, I've been monitoring this court case since it got started, and it's now pretty much over, and the results have been nothing short of fascinating. And believe it or not, it's actually a big win for authors and creatives, whether you use AI or not. Now, if you're new here, my name is Jason. I wrote 14 books the traditional way, worked at Kindlepreneur for a number of years, which, by the way, they have a really impressive article on this exact topic, so you should go check them out. I'll link to it down below. But I started this channel as a way to show authors how to use AI as a productivity tool without actually compromising your creativity or ethics. I should also point out that I am not a lawyer, and none of this should be taken as actual legal advice. I have tried to do my due diligence to actually find credible sources for this, though, so hopefully this will be useful in just breaking down this case for you. So what exactly is this lawsuit all about? Well, it was filed in late 2023 when three authors, Andrea Bartz, Charles Graeber, and Kirk Wallace Johnson, filed a class action lawsuit against Anthropic, which is the company behind Claude. And if you have been a fan of this channel for a while, you know I really enjoy the Claude models. They tend to be one of the best ones at creative writing. But they claimed that Anthropic used their books along with millions of others to train its AI without permission, something they thought was wrong, and understandably so. Now, just as a reminder of what copyright actually protects, I like to think of it in terms of the 3 Ds. So you have the display of a text, the distribution of that text, and the derivation of that text. Now, in this case, derivation is not really applicable, as it's next to impossible to actually get AI to create derivative work without the express instruction of the user, in which case the user would actually be the one culpable for feeding it with these derivative instructions. You know, like if I asked it to create Star Wars fan fiction, for example, and then I went and tried to sell that fan fiction, that's not really the fault of the AI, that's more my issue. And a lot of these AI models actually have safeguards in place to sort of prevent any sort of derivative type of copyright infringement. It's not perfect, but they do try to do that. Now, the display of a copyrighted text is also something that large language models can't really do, because once again, there's safeguards to prevent that sort of thing. It's really, really difficult to try and get a large language model to give you more than a tiny quote or two here from other books. Often those quotes will be wrong, and trying to get it to produce a more substantial piece of the text is just not something it can do, because remember, these models they don't have a database that they're drawing from when they were trained on these models. The training happens, and then the training data is discarded. It isn't needed anymore. And so all it's done is it's learned the probability of language from that training data, which means, yes, in some cases, it might be able to, from a probability standpoint, get something that's close to the original text, but it's actually really, really difficult from the way large language models work to display the text. And so any lawsuits that have come trying to argue that these large language models are displaying text of copyrighted material to the end user essentially get thrown out, because there's absolutely nothing that can really be brought as evidence for that. However, we have the 3rd D, and that is distribution. And this was the main issue around this lawsuit, and the one for which the large settlement occurred. So what do we get out of this lawsuit? Put simply, there are a number of things that got really definitively decided on by the judge on what this gives us. The first is that training Claude on legally purchased books was officially deemed fair use. We're not likely to see that change, because one of the things that Anthropic was doing is they were purchasing books and then scanning them, and then using those scans, the digitization of those books in their training data. And additionally, the judge found that digitizing those print books that Anthropic bought and using those for training, that was also deemed fair use. And for good reason, honestly. Like, if I buy a book and then I digitize it for myself, just for my own purposes, and I'm not distributing it to anybody else, I'm not giving it away to anybody, I'm just using it for my own purposes, And I actually have done this. I actually have a book scanner. I'll show you one example. I recently bought this and a bunch of other little pamphlets like this from Alex Hormozy, and there's no ebook version of this. And I wanted to have an ebook version that I could carry around on my Kindle. I cannot do that and then give away the digitization that I have created, but I can 100% scan this and then run it through a prompt locally on my computer that transcribes it. And then from there, I can put that on my own Kindle, and that is fair use because I'm only using it for myself. I am not creating derivative work from it. I am not displaying it to other people publicly, and I am not distributing it in any way. So as long as I want to have that right to be able to do that for myself, and as long as you want to have the right to be able to do pretty much whatever you want with the stuff that you have purchased, it makes sense that this would be fair use and that Anthropic would also have the same legality assigned to it, because a business is treated legally much in the same way as an individual is. And if we were to change that, it would create a pretty dangerous precedent for what we could do with our own work that we purchased. So those first two things, the purchasing, scanning, and digitization of those books was considered fair use by the judge, which is actually really a handy thing to know that that is okay. However, Claude was also trained on databases that included pirated training data, aka data that was pulled from pirated websites where those websites were illegally distributing the work. Now, I think we all know that pirating is bad and is definitely illegal and against copyright protection. And remember that copyright protects against the display and distribution of a work. And when Anthropic pulled from those pirated data sets, they were essentially aiding in the illegal distribution of that work. So while buying and digitizing books to use in a data set is deemed fair use and completely legal, using pirated books in the same data set was not. And this is what the judge ruled, and this is why Anthropic eventually settled this lawsuit with the plaintiffs. So what does the settlement look like, and can we as authors actually benefit from it? Well, Anthropic has agreed to settle for a whopping $1.5 billion to be paid to a settlement fund, which can then be distributed to authors who qualify. That's approximately $3,000 per book for the estimated count of 500,000 books. And if there are more than 500,000 books found, Anthropic will pay an additional $3,000 per book to the fund. Hey, Jason from the future here. Just as I was about to post this video, some news came out that the judge had actually rejected that $1.5 billion settlement, saying it was, quote, nowhere close to complete. And I think his main concern was just inefficiency in the detail and transparency. He thought it risked actually unfair payouts to authors. And yeah, he just generally wasn't happy with it. So that just shows that like a lot of this stuff is in flux, and things may change, and we don't really know what exactly this is going to look like when it's finally finalized. Most of what the other things I say in this video are still relevant though, so we'll just go back to that. Now, as a side note, for those of you who are hoping that Anthropic and AI's demise from cases like this, I have bad news for you, because Anthropic just recently raised their valuation by $13 billion to a total of $183 billion. $1.5 billion actually isn't, it's kind of a drop in the bucket considering the investments and the investment money that they have. And the same goes for other AI companies that are even bigger than Anthropic. But Anthropic must also delete all pirated books from their training data set going forward. That was also part of the settlement. This is only relevant for future training materials, as this lawsuit does not work retroactively to past models that were trained on this data. And as I mentioned before, you don't have to have, like, once a model has been trained on the training data, it doesn't need that training data anymore. So just by throwing out the pirated data, it's not actually going to make our current Claude models perform any worse because they've already been trained. That part is over. And the way legal cases like this work is that it doesn't work retroactively. They don't have to stop using the Claude models just because those Claude models were trained on pirated data. All this does is it prevents Anthropic from using pirated work in the future for their future data sets and for their future large language models that they train. So just a clarifying note there. So how can authors take advantage of this if you want to get that $3,000 per work, for example? Now, as of right now, the comprehensive list of affected works is still in development, but that will be available eventually. And in the meantime, you can visit a tool that I'll link to below from The Atlantic, and that will show you if your book was included in LibGen, which is one of the big databases that Anthropic used and was in question here. So that should give you an idea of whether or not you qualify to earn some kickback from this. However, there are a few qualifications authors must have in order to qualify for these damages. And unfortunately, this is going to rule out a lot of you. The first is that this only applies to those in the US, as this was a US copyright case, and so only applies in the US. You must also have a registered copyright for the book in question, and that copyright needs to have been filed within 5 years of having published it and before Anthropic used it to train your models. So you can't just go out and copyright your book right now and then expect to get compensated for it. It needs to have that copyright applied to it within 5 years of the publishing of that book. Now, unfortunately for self-published authors, most of us do not actually copyright every single book because it costs money and there's a hassle behind it. And in my case, I only had one book that I've copyrighted that is also on the LibGen database. So the most I could possibly get from this maybe would be $3,000 for the one book. And we actually found out because of this case that a lot of traditional publishers were also not filing copyright for some of the books that they published, because a lot of people were looking into this and realizing that their book was not published, even though in most cases traditional publishers are contractually obligated to file copyright for the book. So if you are a traditionally published author, make sure to check that your book has been filed in the Copyright Office for a U.S. copyright. Now, the third qualification is that your book must also have an International Standard Book Number, or ISBN. This is less likely to be a problem because even if you didn't purchase an ISBN for yourself, if you published it on a platform like Amazon, you will have gotten one anyway. So your book will have an ISBN as long as you published it somewhere, and it doesn't have to be an ISBN that you purchased. So all that said, if you think that you might qualify, if you check the LibGen database and you find out that you have books in there and those books were copyrighted at the time that Anthropic used them, your book has an ISBN number, then you might qualify. And so there's a website I will link to down below, anthropicCopyrightSettlement.com, where you can go and submit your copyright information and your contact information. And I think there will be other updates on this as we go along, where you might be able to get more clear instructions about what to do. Don't worry, this is not something, these cases take a long time, so this is not something you need to rush for just yet. We don't even have the official list of affected works yet. So at the very least, we can wait until that's out before starting to figure out how can we get our damages for this. So why do I say that this is a good thing for authors, even if you are a pro AI author? Well, first of all, after years of arguing and moaning and groaning, we finally have some solid legal precedent for what is and isn't legal around using copyrighted works for training data. And in other words, legally acquiring a copy of a book and using that seems to be fine, while using pirated data is not. And this will likely lead to a lot of AI companies being a little bit more careful about the data that they include to make sure that there is no pirated work in there. Second, this means the authors will get at a minimum at least one legally bought copy of their book for training data purposes. And that's not going to sound like a lot and definitely not enough for most people, but I think it's actually better than what I would have expected, honestly. And I think we'll see more companies giving higher licensing options in order to sell exclusive rights to training data in the future. So for instance, if they want to train on your book and other AI companies aren't allowed to do so, they want to buy that exclusive right from you, that could potentially drive more competition for training data, that sort of thing. So having more of these licensing deals will also make their legal right to those books far more ironclad, which I'm sure is a security that most of these companies would want. Now, unfortunately, what this doesn't do is provide authors with a way of opting out of training LLMs on their books. That might be something we see in the future, but since these companies can now clearly just buy a copy of your book and digitize it without your permission, because that is considered fair use, clearly, there are lots of things that I can do with your book without permission, because once I've bought that book, I have fair use to do a lot of things with it, as long as I don't distribute, display publicly, or create derivative works from that book, which are the only things that copyright protects against. And copyright doesn't protect me against photocopying your book for my own purposes as long as I don't distribute it, or for using it as toilet paper if I so desire. Well, people do that. But ultimately, I think having clear rules around training data is nothing but a good thing. And this is just the start. I think we're going to start actually seeing a lot of these gray areas get much more well-defined from a legal standpoint, from a licensing standpoint, and all of that. And if you're a pro AI author, this is good news for you as well. It doesn't mean that these LLMs are going to get dumber because they can't train on pirated material. If anything, now that AI companies know for sure that they can legally buy a copy of a book and digitize it, we might actually see more books join the data sets, because they can now add books that either weren't digital or weren't in pirated data sets. And it's a heck of a lot cheaper to buy one copy and digitize it than to pay $3,000 in legal fees per book, which, as I established, even $1.5 billion is a drop in the bucket for these huge tech companies. The last reason why I think this is a good thing is that now that this precedent has been set, we're going to see more lawsuits coming against other AI companies who have also trained their models on copyrighted works. There's already several of them in process, and we're going to probably see a lot more settlements of this type type. In this case, we'll make it much easier for the plaintiffs to argue whether or not there was infringement that occurred. And I'll keep you up to date as this case continues unfolding, including where you'll be able to go once the full listing of infringing works is officially published. And if this video was useful for you, I would be happy if you could just do all the YouTube stuff. We talk a lot about AI and creative writing on this channel. I also have some ways to work with me a little bit more directly. We do challenges in my gold group, like a book in a month challenge. Right now, we're writing a short story without AI as a sort of creative writing exercise to try and actually improve our skills. So we're very serious about actually not just writing with AI, but building our own creativity in the process and using AI as a productivity tool. So if that's interesting to you, links are all down below, and I will see you in the next video.